All right, so today we're going to finish chapter 5. We are going to first discuss tax incidence, which I'll explain what that means in a moment. Then we'll then we'll discuss the relationship between government revenue and tax rates. This is informally known as the Laffer curve. I don't like that name. I'll talk about why. And finally, we'll end up talking about the Ramsey rule. I want to remind you, we do have assignments due tonight, Chapter 7, Inquisitive, and Chapter 5, SmartWorks. So make sure, if you haven't completed those, to complete them. And we're going to have our third quiz in 2 weeks from today over Chapters 5 and 7. So we'll finish Chapter 5 today, and then we'll finish Chapter 7 the week after fall break. Just a reminder, there's going to be no or not much lecture on Tuesday. If I don't finish all these topics, there will be a little bit of one perhaps. I don't plan on there being one for Tuesday. I've posted an online lecture. It's about equity and efficiency and taxes in general. So you should listen to that sometime in the next couple days or during fall break, but I suggest doing it beforehand. And finally, on Tuesday, I'm going to post a audio clip discussing exam grades. And if you want to come into a class for the 2 o'clock class, you're more than welcome to. I will go over the exam, and if only a few of you come in, and we can look at each of your exams individually for exam 1. But I will not be live streaming on Tuesday or making a video recording in class on Tuesday next week. So that's just for people who want to look at their grades, in particular their exam 1 grade. All right. What is tax incidence? Well, hopefully you listened to my online lecture I posted Tuesday night. But tax incidence is essentially the following. Who bears the burden of the tax? That's what tax incidence answered. If you saw from my posted lecture, those graphs, it doesn't matter whether the buyer pays the tax or the seller pays the tax, the outcome is the same. Now, in both of those graphs, I drew it such that it wasn't clear who actually bore more of the tax burden. So we want to know who bears the tax burden. And what we're going to do is we're going to use an example. This is a real-life example to show it. So in the 90s, early 90s, they came up with something known as the luxury tax. This was a tax on luxury goods. Do you think this was popular with people? It was very popular. People love taxing the rich. The rich can pay their fair share. It's a tax on yachts. It's a tax on expensive jewelry. It's a tax on expensive cars, etc. It was a popular tax. It was a very popular tax because most people didn't pay it. People like taxes they don't pay. What do you know? What a surprise. So we're going to look at the effect of that tax on the market for luxury goods. This is stuff, by luxury, I mean like really expensive stuff here. As usual, those of you live streaming, you're more than welcome to email me a question. I do have my email open. All right. So think about this from the demand curve's perspective. We're going to go back to incorporating elasticity. What is the demand for luxury goods going to be like? Is it going to be elastic or inelastic? Well, first off, remember those 4 determinants with that lovely acronym? Substitutes. Are there substitutes for luxury goods in the U.S.? Remember, they can't tax a global tax. So you can have a yacht in Florida, but can't you also have a yacht in Mexico? Yes, so there are substitutes. There are substitutes. All right. Income, habit versus, habit or want need. Is this something that is a need or a habit? No. You can, obviously, by definition, they're luxuries. These are things that are a splurge. So the first two things are going to make it elastic income percent. Even if you're rich, a yacht can be expensive, right? I'm not talking Bill Gates, but I mean, someone who just owns their own business. It's going to make it elastic. All these things are going to make demand elastic. Just time doesn't apply in this one, really, so forget about time. So what's the demand curve going to look like? This is a good review. Good. So someone in the audience is showing a very flat arm, so very flat. Trying to draw it fairly flat. Now, supply, we're just going to say it's lots of different types of goods in terms of production technology, so we're just going to draw it as neither elastic nor inelastic. All right. Now, they're going to tax the rich, so the buyers are going to be taxed. Which curve is going to move? Which curve are we going to draw the tax on if the buyers are taxed? Demand or supply? Demand. We're going to look at demand minus the tax. Everyone with me so far? Excellent. This is the initial market quantity and of course this, and by the way, this was the initial market price. This is the new quantity with the tax. That says Q with tax if you're struggling to read it live streaming. Now let's draw the prices. So this right here is the price the seller receives. And this up here is the price the buyer pays with the tax. So first off, just looking at the price, who is harmed more here in terms of the price, the buyer or the seller? So after the tax is implemented, who bears more of the burden in terms of the price they pay? Or price they receive in seller's case? The seller. They're getting a lot less. Everyone see that? The seller is getting a lot less, while the buyer is just paying a tiny bit more. Why is that? Intuitively, it's because the buyers have other options. Right? It's because demand is elastic. All right, so notice the seller bears more of the burden even though the buyer is the one taxed. All right? Everyone see that? So the seller bears more of the burden even though the buyer is assigned to pay the tax. It turns out this tax didn't hit the rich as much as they wanted because the rich customers are basically avoiding it. You might say, well, some people who own those businesses are rich, some, but not all. People who built yachts, people who made commission off selling expensive jewelry, etc. These were good middle-class jobs. But now this is an awful industry. Output went from here to here, and what they earned went from here to here. They wrote to Congress and begged them. They said, the rich are not paying the tax. We are paying the tax. Obviously, they weren't literally paying the tax, but they were bearing the burden of the tax. And so this is an example of an unintended consequence. A policy that might seem good on its face might not actually do what we want it to do. And so it's not who is assigned to pay the tax that matters, but it's the elasticity that determines who pays the tax. So elasticity determines who bears the tax burden. And it turns out the more inelastic curve, the curve that's relatively more inelastic, bears more of the burden. And I put that word relatively as important because they could both be elastic or both be inelastic, right? So whichever one is more inelastic, if they're both inelastic, is going to bear more of the burden. So I'm not going to drop, but let's think about cigarettes. Is that going to have elastic or inelastic demand? More inelastic demand, and particularly for older smokers, maybe not for younger smokers, but for older smokers. It's a lifelong habit. So whenever we raise the tax on cigarettes, is it the buyer or the seller paying them? More the buyer. And in fact, at first, when the government increased cigarette taxes, the sellers didn't really care because they knew it was all going to be passed on to the buyer. That's changed because they've gotten so high, and it's gotten to the point where it actually does deter buyers. Not so much in Missouri as much in other places. But one critique, and this is going to be something if you haven't listened to my lecture yet, which most of you probably haven't, that I posted on equity and efficiency, this is an example of a regressive tax. Are poor, older people who smoke typically super wealthy? No. On average, not all, there are some who are super wealthy, but on average, they are poorer. So the tax on cigarettes is a regressive tax. Regressive means lower income pay a larger percentage of the tax. And a lot of people don't like regressive tax. That's something I talk about progressive taxes in the lecture that I posted earlier. But regressive tax is the opposite. The poor pay a larger percent of it. Now, the week after next week, we're going to talk about smoking as a negative externality, and there's an economic argument to be made about that. Okay? But we'll get to that later. All right, one more case. I want to think about the extreme case, and early economists actually used to argue for this, which is a land tax. So if you think about the city of San Francisco, and actually I think I'm going to go out of order. I think I'm going to talk about the Ramsey rule first. So let's think about the market for land in San Francisco. So why did I draw supply like this? There's a fixed amount of land in San Francisco. Right? You could argue that maybe for low prices, some people won't sell their land, so it slopes up at first and then kinks up, but at some point we run out of land in San Francisco. And let's say we're at that point already, so we can just draw it like this for simplicity. So let's tax the buyers. So we already taxed the buyers. Who remembers how we taxed the buyers? We're going to look at the demand curve minus the tax. So first off, does everyone see that the quantity actually doesn't change? It's the same. This is the price the seller receives. This is the price the buyer pays, but this is also the original market price. Before, this was consumer surplus. Does everyone see consumer surplus actually doesn't change? The area between the demand curve and the price the buyer pays is the same. What changes is before this whole rectangle was producer surplus. Now it's just the bottom. What is this middle part? This is a good test to see. Watch my. Beg your pardon? Tax revenue. I use government revenue, but you're right. It's revenue for the government. So GR. How much deadweight loss is here? There isn't any. Why isn't there any deadweight loss? It's because those things didn't change. You're right. So the student said the market price and quantity didn't change. Well, the price didn't change for the buyer at least, but the market quantity didn't change for sure. Because supply is perfectly inelastic. And notice who bears all of the tax burden. So this is infinitely more inelastic than the demand curve. In fact, when we ever have a vertical curve, that curve is always going to bear all the tax. They're going to bear the burden of the entire tax. All right, everyone hear what I said? Perfectly elastic, the other curve is going to bear the burden. So if demand were perfectly elastic, then whatever the supply curve is going to bear all the burden of the tax. But here, when it's perfectly inelastic, the inelastic curve bears all the burden. So this relates back to tax incidence. But I said there's no deadweight loss. And this is related to what's known as the Ramsey rule. The Ramsey rule states to tax goods that have more inelastic supply and demand curves. So in this case, we have one that's infinitely inelastic. So Ramsey would love this market. This would be a great market to tax. And in fact, a lot of older economics textbooks talk about taxing land for this reason. Land used to be a lot more important in terms of wealth than it is now. And we still do have property taxes, which are not quite land taxes because you're not assessed on the amount of land like a per unit tax. You're assessed on the value of the home or the estimated value of the property or home, or both. But we still have them. And in fact, some people argue that those are better taxes, and this is again relates to the lecture I posted tonight, if you haven't listened earlier today, which are more, that hit the wealthy more actually. All right, because the wealthy, it's hard to avoid property taxes on $1 million house. Now here's the problem with the Ramsey rule. So there are some cases where it's good. Here's another case where it's good, and cities often have this. Seasonal hotel taxes. What does the supply curve for hotels look like when all of the hotels fill up? Perfectly inelastic, right? I mean, I suppose maybe not perfectly inelastic. They could put people, in the parking lot in tents or something, but almost perfectly inelastic. Almost perfectly inelastic. So a lot of cities have seasonal hotel taxes for only when it's full. So for example, in Arizona, that seasonal tax would be during the winter. Right? In other places, it's going to be during the summer. And in some places, it's full all the time, like by Disneyland, that they just have a seasonal tax year-round. It's not a seasonal tax, I guess. They have a tax year-round on hotel occupancy. And sometimes they have taxes for special events, like football games. So if you go to South Bend, Indiana, not now, obviously, but during non-pandemic times, during a Notre Dame football game, it's impossible to find a hotel. And they're super expensive, and in part, it's because there's these taxes added. And those are efficient taxes by the Ramsey rule. We're not losing much surplus because the rooms are filling up anyway. Now, those are the good Ramsey rules, quote unquote. I mean, I'm not saying we should have those taxes, but if you believe in the Ramsey rule, that's sort of a good argument for it. Here's other cases for the Ramsey rule. A kidney dialysis machine. Isn't demand almost perfectly inelastic? Well, why don't we tax the heck out of that? Water and food. We could tax the heck out of that, right? People are going to pay for it. They need it. And water. Does anyone see a problem with the Ramsey rule, especially when it comes to the demand curve? We got 3 people in this class. Anyone? Right, these are things that you need to survive. So the person in the class said need. These are items that you do not survive without with. So in some ways, the Ramsey rule is really actually, what's the word I'm looking for? Is not very practical. People like to tax things like luxury goods. So the thing that is popular to tax is often something that has very elastic supply and demand. And so the tax isn't that effective. It's going to create lots of deadweight loss, and it's not going to raise that much revenue because it creates that debt. Remember, when something's very elastic, with both curves are very elastic, not only is there going to be a lot of deadweight loss, but the quantity is going to be a lot smaller. So the tax isn't going to be effective at raising revenue either. Right? When the curve is very inelastic, that Q doesn't change very much. And so the tax is not only distorts markets very little, it's effective at raising revenue. And so the things that are popular to tax are not very effective at raising revenue. And if you look at the Affordable Care Act, they had a lot of taxes that were not popular. I mean, there was a lot of stuff in it that was popular, so I'm not saying whether it's a good or bad policy. Again, that's a normative statement, but there were taxes in there that weren't popular, the medical device tax in particular, and the tax on Cadillac health insurance. And the idea is those things are pretty inelastic, right? And so those are sort of efficient taxes that follow the Ramsey rule, but people don't like that stuff being taxed. People want luxury cars to be taxed. Right, so we have this issue where the Ramsey rule doesn't always work because, practically speaking, people like goods to be taxed that are quote unquote luxuries, which means they're going to be elastic supply and or demand, particularly demand. All right, are there any questions on that? Okay, by the way, the Cadillac tax on the Affordable Care Act was repealed. I don't know if the medical device tax was. I can't remember. All right. So, tax incidence, the Ramsey rule. Now we're going to talk about the relationship between the tax rate and the tax revenue. So draw a really big graph. This is going to be even harder to do this year since I'm not doing it on the board. But this can be any market. It can be the market for cigarettes. It can be the market for whatever you want. So this is just a typical supply and demand curve, nothing special here. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the relationship between tax rates and government revenue. If the tax rate is equal to 0, so I'm going to draw a smaller graph over here. Here we have GR, that stands for government revenue. And this is another reason I don't use TR. And then we have TR here. I'll just put tax rate, which stands, I'll just write it. This is tax rate. So right now, we're in the market. There is no tax. How much revenue is the government going to make? Nothing, right? That's pretty intuitive, right? If you have a 0 tax rate, doesn't matter if they sell 1, it doesn't matter if they sell at 10,000. The government's not going to make any money. So at 0, At a zero tax rate, government revenue is zero. That's what that point says. Well, we need taxes. I mean, even if you argue for low taxes, 99% of people are going to say that society needs taxation so we can have some form of government. Even if you believe government should be minimal, we need some form of taxation. So let's say that we're going to tax whatever this product is. We're going to put an excise tax on it, whatever. We're going to do a per unit tax because it's easier. And we'll call it T1. And we're going to just tax the sellers because taxing sellers is usually easier than taxing buyers. So this is S plus T1. Didn't draw it perfectly. I will do my best to draw these, but it gets hard. So this was Q0, right? This is the tax where the tax rate is 0. I'll call this Q1. This is the quantity with Q1. And notice the distance between these supply curves is the tax, right? And so the area of this box right here is the government revenue with tax rate 1, which I call GR1. Everyone see that that's GR1? Does everyone agree that the government revenue from the tax rate of 1 is higher than the government revenue with a tax rate of 0? So we'll plot that point right here. So this is T1, and this is GR1. Well, the city's in financial trouble. So let's think of this as a city tax. I'll draw a different color to try to reduce confusion. So they decide to double the tax to T2. So imagine this is double. I tried to draw it roughly double. So this red, this is getting messy, is GR2, this red box. All right, sorry, this is kind of messy. This is hard to do on pencil and paper. But this red is GR2, that red box. See if I have another color pen, because the different pens are very helpful here. I don't have a blue pen. I'll use a pencil. It's a little different. Unless this pen is blue, but I don't think it is. It is not. All right. So does everyone see that the government revenue went up, right? So we gained this little piece, we gained this little piece. Of course, there's fewer people buying it, right? And so we do lose this little square. So we lose this square, but we gain these two squares. So it went up. Now, we doubled the tax rate. Did we double the revenue? I know the answer is no. How do I know that even though I doubled the tax rate, I did not double the revenue? The only way I could have doubled the revenue is if Q didn't change. But everyone sees Q went down, right? Since Q went down, I less than doubled the tax rate. So even though T1 doubled it to T2, it didn't actually double here. It less than doubled. It went up, but it didn't double. Everyone see that? It went up, but it didn't double. Now we can keep going up. I'll just draw the most extreme. Suppose they really, really want to tax people at this T3. It intersects at what that's called the choke price. It's called the choke price because if the price gets high enough, no one buys it. How much tax revenue is the governor bringing in this case? The government. Nothing. Maybe I didn't draw it perfectly, but I meant to draw it at nothing. And any tax rate above this, it's still going to be nothing. So imagine, so if you're wondering, well, that's ridiculous. Why would the government do that? So I don't disagree, but the purpose of this is just so you understand the relationship between tax rates and tax revenue. If the government said you're going to pay $1,000 for every pack of cigarettes you purchase, How many people do you think are going to legally purchase cigarettes? Very few. Very few. All right. Very few people are going to purchase cigarettes. And of course, firms would eventually quit selling them probably in the long run. But in the short run, they have all these packs on the shelves. At least legally. I'm not saying people aren't going to smoke, but legally people are going to quit buying them. And the government's not going to make money. All right. So T4 and anything beyond T4, the revenue from the government is actually, hold on, I know this very well. The revenue from the government is going to be 0, something like that. I'm going to call this point T star. And I'm going to call this point GR star. So what do I call that point T star, and what do I call that point GR star? To the right of it. Yep, I like that word. Say that again. Right, so a student in the room said it's the maximum what? So this is the maximum government revenue. So GR star is the maximum amount, the government can collect. All right, it's the maximum amount the government can collect. In other words, the relationship between tax rates is not positive. As one goes up, the other doesn't necessarily go up. It's going to have this upside down U shape. It has this upside down U shape. Now, in terms of policy, what does this mean? It means we can't tax every good forever, which should be intuitive. And let's talk about it in terms of income tax in just a moment. But not everyone understands this. I believe it was Chicago. I could be wrong on the city. So think about the price of writing the L as a tax, right? Because really it costs them nothing to let you in there, right? And the government decides it. So imagine that anything they charge is a tax, right? So at first, if they charge you something to ride the L, the government is going to bring in more revenue. But if it costs a lot to ride the L, what are some people going to do? They're not going to ride the L. They're going to take other means of transportation. They might walk, etc. I'm not talking about pandemic times. I'm talking about non-pandemic times. Well, the city was in fiscal trouble, and they said, we're going to raise it. Economists were saying, don't do it. But they said, every time we did it in the past, we made more revenue. Things are different. So what's different now than 20 years ago, for example? There's lots of more means of transportation. There's Uber and there's Lyft. All right, Uber and Lyft have made traveling in cities much easier for many people. You don't have to have a car. Before, you either had to bring your car in, take a taxi from the suburbs, which could be ridiculously expensive, or take a taxi from within the city. I guess that's a different train that meets the L to go out to the suburbs, the far suburbs anyway. By the way, for those who aren't familiar, the L is the public transportation subway system in Chicago. And so when they raised the rates, fewer people actually used it. They actually lost, well, of course fewer people use it, but they lost money compared to what they were charging before, because the loss in the quantity demanded, the loss in quantity was so much that it offset the increase in price. So people have this fallacy where they think, oh, we'll double cigarette taxes, we're going to double the revenue. Is that logic correct? If cigarette taxes are doubled, no. Unless it's perfectly inelastic, but with cigarettes, that's not true. Particularly younger smokers, they often are the first ones to drop out. Yes? Is that what happened there? During that tax. Well, it's like, I just kind of had like the idea, like, I don't know would that work? I don't think so, because I think people would just buy, especially in countries that are not an island, they could just buy it and bring it in. So someone asked about taxing goods in a country that are luxury goods. So this is actually the problem in general. Actually, I was going to talk about this, so I'm glad you brought this up. I talk a little bit about, in that video, of a carbon tax on luxury goods. The problem with that is the rich are so good at evading taxes. And what they're going to do is only some countries are going to do it, and those countries are the ones going to miss out. So let's say we tax first class plane tickets, because we don't want the poor to pay the tax, but we want the rich to pay the carbon tax, because planes actually uses a lot of carbon. Well, if only one country does it, a lot of wealthy people are going to say, well, there's lots of countries I can go to. I'm just not going to go to that country. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to have luxury, and there's a push to, if there's global coordination, to do it. But in order for it to be really effective, you're going to have a lot of countries involved. All right, and this actually happens quite frequently with all sorts of taxes. There's taxes where if everyone did it, it might be good, maybe. Of course, it might just depend on your outlook and your philosophy. But if only one country does it, it's just not good for that particular country. All right, and we're seeing that. I kind of talked about that as well with Florida and New York, because a lot of people are leaving the Northeast and moving to Florida, and that hurts their tax revenue, right? In the long run, is it okay? I mean, New York is special. It's different from Florida. Some people will do anything to live in New York. But, you know, if Florida is that much cheaper, people are going to keep moving there. I mean, that's just a fact. All right. So one more thing, I want to talk about what I call political Laffer curve. So this in general is called the quote-unquote Laffer curve. It's named after Art Laffer, who was one of Reagan's economists. And I don't like the name the Laffer curve because it gives him credit for something most economists have known about for a long time. What he did something important. He popularized the idea. Or he popularized the idea in terms of supply side economics and all that. This was kind of part of it, not the only thing. What the Laffer curve was saying is that essentially if we overtax things, it's actually counterproductive. We're worse off in many ways, because if we overtax things, we actually can make less revenue in some cases, which is the next topic I'm really going to get to. So this is obvious. I mean, this is true, right? Now the question is, what is that T-star? That's what's up for debate. How high can we raise those cigarette taxes, for example? $1,000 a pack? Obviously not. $5 a pack? $10 a pack? I don't know. You could probably figure it out. And of course, it's different in the long run. Maybe in the short run, you can squeeze a bunch of money out of people because it's hard to quit cigarettes. But in the long run, if it's a really high tax, people are going to start trying to quit. So there's that question as well, right? The book talks about that. Remember, in the long run, curves are more elastic. In the short run, they're more inelastic. But what Art Laffer said, and you can agree or disagree with him, is he made the following argument, and I'll make a counter argument in a minute. What he really cared about was the relationship between the government revenue and the income tax. So I'm going to draw two Laffer curves. Again, I don't like that name. I think there's even like documentation over 1,000 years old or multiple thousand years old from China that shows that people knew about this for a while, but Art Laffer popularized the idea. So I'm going to call this right here a conservative Laffer curve. And over here, I'm going to call it a liberal Laffer curve. You'll see why when I'm done, hopefully. So tax rates in the early part of, in the mid part of this last century, in the 1950s and 1960s, were really high in the United States, the marginal tax rates at least. All right, that's the last dollar you earn. How much do you pay on that last dollar? All right. And so what Art Laffer said is, look, if we don't tax any, yes, we get nothing. But if we tax 100% of income, I'm going to put a 1 for 100. Does everyone agree that people are going to try to evade taxes completely? If you have to give everything you earn to the government and maybe just not do any work, right? So what Art Laffer thought, this was his idea, I don't know if he, is that, you know what? Maybe the optimal marginal tax rate, I don't know if he came up with this number, I'm just making this up. This is not scientific, it just makes the point. Maybe it's 0.2 or 0.3. I guess that looks more like 0.3. Let's say it's 0.3. A little less than what it is today. Today, the highest marginal tax rate is about 0.37, I believe. And so he made the argument, we can cut taxes and we can make more revenue. But that's only if the Laffer curve looks like that. It could be the case, maybe the Laffer curve looks like this. Maybe revenue is maximized with that 70% tax rate. If you believe in high taxation, then you should believe that the curve looks like this. Why? Well, unless you believe taxation is a means of sort of creating more equality. In other words, you don't mind taxing someone and actually reducing tax revenue at the same time, which some people believe, and that's fine. But if the Laffer curve looks like this, look what happens when you have a tax rate of 0.7. You're actually worse off, right? And of course, if you have a more conservative philosophy, you'll argue the Laffer curve looks something more like this. Maybe. You could also argue that you just believe in low taxes in general. So that's another thing. T star isn't necessarily the optimal tax rate. T star is the highest optimal, or the highest possible optimal tax rate. It's going to be between 0 and T star. A government should tax between 0 and T star. Everyone understand why it's the liberal and conservative Laffer curve? Just one more thing I want to discuss before we go, because we're almost out of time. That's the payroll tax. Who knows what the payroll taxes are? It's actually more than one, but one of them's much more than the other. So there's only 3 people in the room. Do any of you currently have a source of income? It's some of the taxes that come out of each paycheck. Anyone know which particular ones? No, that's income taxes. So there's state and federal income taxes. Go ahead. Good. So the other students at Social Security and Medicare, that is correct. Those are payroll taxes. Now, payroll taxes are a percentage. They are not a per unit tax, but the idea is the same. So when they came up with the payroll taxes, they made the following argument. They said they're going to tax the worker at, I think it's 7.1%. I can't remember the exact amount. And that might just be for Social Security, or maybe it's 6.1. It's somewhere between 6 and 8%. I don't remember the exact. And they're going to tax the seller or the firm who hires the worker the other half, the other 7%. So the total is like 14% for any income below, I believe, 120,000. And that's fair, quote unquote. That's the fair way to do it because each is paying half. Is each paying half? So this is a good quiz question. Is each paying half in the payroll tax? Or good test question. What determines who pays the tax? Does the government determine who pays the tax? Right, who actually not pays, who bears the burden of the tax? You're right, it's going to be the elasticity of the supply and demand curves. And everyone seems to think that the firms have more power, and maybe that's true. But we workers aren't powerless. Yes, firms can automate, and firms can outsource, and firms can make the customer do things, but can't families have one source of income instead of two, and sort of in-source as well? Instead of picking up food, they make food at home, etc. So companies don't have all the power, so it's not like one of the curves is perfectly inelastic and the worker ends up paying it all. But my point isn't that I know who pays more of it, the workers or the firm, in reality. What I do know is it's not the government determining it, it's the elasticity of the supply of labor and the demand for labor that determines who bears the burden of those taxes. All right. So anyway, I think this is a cool chapter. It's a neat unit. It really does have obviously some of the most practical importance, right? We all are going to pay taxes. We all pay taxes. Even if you just buy something at the store, you have to pay a sales tax. So I hope you enjoyed it. This is the end of it. If you didn't listen to my online lecture, please do. And just a quick reminder, we do have 2 homework assignments due this evening. So if you haven't started them, make sure you finish them before the night ends. And on Tuesday, I will post a clip discussing grades and exam grades. And if you want to come to the 2 o'clock class, you can come to look over the exam. And if there's not very many of you, I'll let you look over your own individual exam. All right, any questions? All right, everyone, have a lovely fall break. Do the homework so you can enjoy break. And please be safe, and please keep social distancing. All right, thank you. Yes, because that's a tax on work, actually.